China is on the brink of collapse, and it seems there's very little that anyone can do about it. With protests breaking out all over the nation as a result of the nation's elderly crisis and the problems around it, it seems the CCP is reacting the way it reacts best, with unwarranted violence. The elderly crisis is perhaps China's biggest problem ever, as it threatens the very existence of the nation. According to estimates done by the World Health Organization, by 2040, which is a few short years from now, Chinese citizens who are aged 60 years or older will number 402 million, almost a third of their entire population. In case you need clarity about this figure, that's more than the entire population of the United States from coast to coast. Just imagine it. A nation as large as the US just filled with retirement-age people. That's scary for the CCP. It's not that we don't love old people, but the imbalance that exists now is a problem for both the CCP and China's economy. This leaves us with quite a number of questions. What led to such a devastating crisis? How, if at all, can it be resolved? And most importantly, what does it mean for the future of China and the whole world, given how China is the manufacturing hub of the world? Let's dive right in and get into all of this today. Before we go on, I'm going to ask a huge favor from you. The trend on this channel is clear. Any videos that talk about the CCP or Chinese failings tend to get swarmed with negative comments from bots as a CCP strategy to stop the spread of information that they may view as harmful to their image. That's why your likes are necessary as they combat these bots and allow us to share these videos without fear or prejudice. So please drop a like. Okay, with that said, let's move on. Just like with all things, in order to understand how this old people crisis came to be, we need to take a bit of a history lesson so that we can get to the root of the matter. It so happens that, in this case, our roots are based in the age of the great Mao Zedong. Back in his day, starting in the spring of 1959, China had a problem. The nation simply had too many mouths to feed and so little food. Some other factors were at play, but that's a story for another day. The bottom line is that, as a result of this food shortage, the nation faced a terrible famine that resulted in over 30 million people starving to death. Fast forward to 1979, and China was starting to face the same problem again. The main culprit this time was the fact that there were simply too many people in the nation, and the resources, though bountiful, could not keep up. China was coming closer to the 1 billion population mark, and they needed to get on top of the situation, or else another famine would be repeated, and that was not an option for the CCP. In the years prior, between 1970 and 1976, Beijing had seen this problem coming and had first started by pushing a birth control and family planning program called Long, Last, and Few. The general idea behind this was women should get married later and have long intervals between the children they had, resulting in fewer births. It worked for a bit, with the total fertility rate declining drastically from 5.7 in 1969 to 2.7 in 1978. However, it was still not enough. China needed a more drastic change to solve the problem they had, so they decided to switch gears. Under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese Communist Party launched a one-child policy, which limited the number of children a family could have to 1. It worked really well in urban environments, and most people became small nuclear families. The government made sure to make contraception readily available and incentivize those who complied. If you followed the policy, the government would subsidize your child's education, give you interest-free loans, and help you get jobs easily. That was the carrot part of it. After starting cute and friendly with the incentives, in the later part of the implementation of the policy, the government implemented the stick. It was here that they started to use abusive measures like forced termination and sterilization. Quite harsh if you ask me, but let's not try to get into the human rights implications of this policy. We'll be at it all day if we do. Let's simply look at the facts of the matter. For the most part, China's twisted policy worked, and birth rates slowed down. By 2015, this figure had dropped to 1.67 births per woman, signifying the policy's success. What was not anticipated and accounted for at the time was the sheer fact that by having such a policy, you're bound to have a smaller base of the youth and a much larger base of the elderly in years to come. After decades of implementation, what we now have is a country filled with older people as compared to the youth. That's to say nothing of the gender disproportionality, where China has over 35 million more men than women. So, though China had won the battle, it lost the war, as can be seen by the fact that it has since tracked back on that policy, realizing how hopeless the situation now is, but it's too late. The effects can be felt, and the rapidly declining birth rate can't seem to be raised in time. With a good portion of China's population being elderly now, we have opened a can of problems that needed more than a band-aid. Let's take a look at some of the effects that this elderly crisis is having on China and the world as a whole. Since we will be using this term a lot, allow me to just repeat its definition once again so that we all move together. An aging population is created when the fertility rate continues to decline in a country. Don't get me wrong, aging is beautiful, and the gift of long life is a blessing. The problem comes when more people are going through this beautiful process and fewer are taking their place. To give a simple analogy, think of a factory. More products are churned out when raw materials are put into manufacturing. If there are no materials to make products, production dies out. I may have oversimplified my explanation, but basically, this is what's happening right now at an alarming rate. Let's get into the specifics of this. This demographic shift, as a result of the one-child policy that went on for almost 4 decades, has created what is called the 4-2-1 problem. It almost sounds like a football formation, but it is nothing so pleasant. What this basically is how many families now have only one child who is responsible for supporting 2 parents and possibly 4 grandparents. This, of course, places a lot of strain on the child, but what many don't realize is the strain that is placed on the grandparents themselves, the elderly population. We'll dive into that in just a few minutes as we go over the cultural implications, but for now, allow me to explain the economic factors at play in China. Much like the factory example I gave earlier, with a rapidly aging population, the number of elderly people is increasing while the younger workforce is shrinking. This creates a heavy imbalance, and instead of a balanced population pyramid, we're left with this. If you're looking at this graph and your heart is not pounding, then you don't quite understand the gravity of this situation. As China's population ages, the impact is being felt across various sectors, influencing everything from labor markets to healthcare systems. To start with, we're seeing a labor force shrinkage and a declining workforce in the eastern nation. As the population ages, the number of working-age individuals is decreasing. This ongoing trend reduces the available labor force, leading to potential labor shortages in key industries. That undoubtedly impacts China's manufacturing ability and capacity. Bear in mind that China is the manufacturing hub of the world, and it rose to that throne off the backs of cheap labor and its ability to mass produce. According to the United Nations Statistics Division, China's manufacturing input accounts for 28.7% of global manufacturing. Nationally, in 2019, 30% of China's GDP came from manufacturing. That just shows you how seriously China values this role both domestically and globally. If their key commodity, which is plenty of manpower, gets compromised, then they will likely be dethroned by countries such as India, which are nibbling at their heels, thus collapsing their manufacturing empire. I already mentioned in our intro how the World Health Organization estimates that a third of China's population will be over 60 by 2040, which means that it is highly unlikely that they will retain their crown. The difference can already be felt. In 2016, China's labor force stood at 815 million workers, but declined down to 784 million in 2020. In 2023, that number was 5 million less at 779 million. The labor force participation rate has dropped from 77.8% to 75.5%, with projections indicating that the number is only going to plummet further. Naturally, as the workforce decreases, the manufacturing industry is going to be forced to shrink even further. Imagine how many billions of dollars the country is going to lose as a result of companies moving from China to other nations. That will have a direct effect on the investments in the nation. These investments made by other nations and companies into China are a key component to the success of China, so the fact that even more companies will soon begin to jump ship is worrying. This isn't a theoretical thing either. It has already started. Intel, Microsoft, Nike, Amazon, and Dell have all already signaled their intention to move some of their manufacturing out of China to different shores. These announcements mirror an ongoing shift in the global manufacturing landscape, where an increasing number of US companies are turning their backs on Chinese manufacturing. You know part of why these companies are moving out of China and costing the nation billions of dollars? Well, it's because China's production costs have increased as compared to other nations. That's where India, Vietnam, and other countries come into play. Funny enough, it's because of China's aging population that these costs have risen. You see, with fewer workers available because the labor pool is small due to, most people being old, companies are going the extra mile to increase wages to attract talent. In their defense, that's the only way to get capable youth at a time when the youth are protesting and not going to work for various reasons. We have a video on that you can take a look at after you're done here. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that higher wages lead to higher production costs and reduced competitiveness in the global market. That places China's economy in a more compromised position and creates an unending cycle of problems. With more companies leaving because of higher costs, the higher the unemployment rate gets, and so on and so on. It's a disastrous situation to say the least. When we talk about decline as a result of all this, we have to talk about what will happen to economic growth. Statistics show that a 1% increase in the aging coefficient will lead to a 0.38% decrease in economic growth. The culmination of the decline on all the other fronts will mean that China will suffer economically. Chinese citizens are in a lot of trouble if their government does not come up with policies to solve this aging problem quickly. On top of the negative effects on the economy, we also have the economic burden that the nation is being forced to endure as a result of China's aging population. You see, there's an increase in what is called the dependency ratio, and that's creating quite a problem. The dependency ratio is a figure that measures the number of dependents, meaning children and the elderly, that are supported by the working age population. That ratio is rising, and it is rising fast. It is expected to be nearly 52% by mid-century, and from there, it will rise even faster. When the dependency ratio gets to 52%, it means that for every 100 people in the working age population, there are 52 dependents. This would mean that for less than 2 working age individuals, there will be 1 dependent. Such a situation puts an untold strain on public resources and even family finances. This is a grave problem, and guess what? With modern medicines comes greater life expectancy, and combined with lower fertility rates, it has resulted in a rapidly aging society, which will only make the dependency ratio more and more unfavorable. This messy situation makes the gift of living long seem like a pain. That brings us to the strain that the government is feeling with the pension system. To keep it pretty simple, China's pension system is in shambles. It's straining to meet demand, and not by a little. Let me back up. See, China's pension system is made up of 3 pillars, including the basic pension system led by the state. The second is a voluntary employee pension plan from employers, and the third is private voluntary pension schemes. Both the corporate and private schemes remain underdeveloped and are far from perfect, whereas the public scheme is already under significant financial pressure. With more people seemingly cashing out than paying in, it will soon be turned on its head, thus causing it to collapse. It is already at a level where the payouts are very small amounts of money, too little for one to live on. The truth of the matter is that without reforms, the system may become unsustainable, leading to potential cuts in benefits or increased taxes on the working population. Again, this will impact the country negatively, but given that their hands are tied, is there really much of a choice? This is one of those times when the entire nation is caught in between a rock and a hard place. This also causes issues in other industries. Another big challenge that China is facing as a result of this elderly crisis is the heat that they're feeling in their healthcare and social services. As the elderly population continues to grow, China is going to have to deal with rising healthcare expenditures. Estimates are showing that healthcare costs could increase by over 50% by 2050. That's an astronomical margin. Chronic illnesses are more prevalent among the elderly, and this means that the need for medical treatment is at an all-time high. The numbers are even scarier than this general fact. The World Health Organization reports that 80% of China's elderly population has at least one chronic disease. This covers over 200 million people. Further research also shows that China has the highest number of dementia patients in the world. The long-term and end-of-life care needed for these patients is going to see China coughing up a lot of money that it does not have. China needs a system that's prepared to provide specialized care and resources to this demographic. Chronic disease management is more costly, and speaking frankly, China's pockets are not deep enough for it. The situation is even more horrifying in rural areas where shortages mean that there are only 1.5 hospital beds for every 1,000 people needing hospitalization. If government funding is not even stretching enough to meet the problem in urban areas, what is the fate of the rural elderly population in China? Well, the one word to describe the situation is disastrous. There are plenty of other problems that China will have to solve as a result of having an aging population as it does. One of those is the need for reformation in industries such as retail, real estate, and technology. You see, older adults tend to spend less on consumer goods and more on healthcare, housing, and services. This shift can lead to changes in market demand, affecting various industries. That's why strategies to handle this change need to be in place. Also, older people tend to consume less, and China's economy and monetary policies will have to account for this change, even at the cost of progress. If you're of the mind that China's innovation will not be affected by an aging population, you're wrong as well. An aging workforce might contribute to a decline in innovation and productivity, as younger workers are typically more adaptable to new technologies and more likely to engage in entrepreneurial activities. This shouldn't surprise you. I mean, just remember all those times when your father or mother asked you for help with something as simple as rebooting the router. What other innovations can you expect from the mass majority of their age mates? Basically, when you consider all this, the Dragon of the East is in an unfavorable position, and addressing these challenges will require comprehensive policy reforms, investments in healthcare and social services, and a shift towards a more knowledge-based and technology-driven economy. All these are easier said than done. We've been talking about the impact that the elderly crisis has on China as a whole, so let's shift gears and see how much that very community we're discussing is suffering as well. Let's begin by talking about the general setting of a Chinese home. We've covered the 4-2-1 model and what it looks like. In this situation, it becomes unreasonable to ask a child to support all 6 parents and grandparents, especially in a tough economy. That is why the elderly of China have to make sacrifices and keep working longer and harder just so that they can support themselves and their children and grandchildren. Because of the aging crisis, there is such an imbalance that parents and grandparents are now chipping in to help their adult children just so that they can stay afloat. With ever-rising costs of living, many young parents rely on financial support from their elderly parents to manage these costs. This lady, who was interviewed by BBC, is a reflection of what is happening in the nation.
Grandma Feng shows me her room in an elderly care home.
You've got a little balcony out the front.
She's decided to pay for long-term care rather than rely on her son.
I'm more open-minded. There are few people of the same age who think like us, and it seems we care more about enjoying life. But I thought it through.
That is what you call a mother's sacrifice. On top of just the financial aid, there's a cultural responsibility that is falling on grandparents to help with childcare. This is because most households are comprised of a mother and father who work, hence the day-to-day care, helping with education and transportation of the grandchildren, is being left to the grandparents. It might be hard to fully grasp this point depending on where in the world you're from, but in China, the concept of filial piety is strong. The concept of filial piety, or respect and care for one's parents, extends to the elderly supporting their adult children. In return, the expectation is that children will care for their parents in old age. Unlike other cultures, in Chinese culture, family ties are strong, and there's a deep-seated expectation that grandparents will help care for their grandchildren. This is seen as a way for the elderly to stay involved and contribute to the family. With pensions being measly and challenges all around, this is proving to be quite the burden on the elderly in a society that does not accept anything less. Also, to tie it in with the pension and social services I spoke of earlier, because China's social safety nets, such as pensions and elder care services, are not sufficiently strong to support the aging population, the elderly are left with quite the hard choice to make. In 2022, the national average monthly payment for the public employment pension was $500 and just $28 for the basic state pension. This is clearly not enough, and so old people are now forced to keep working deep in their old age or rely on their children, who in turn rely on them. This is perfectly expressed in Hao's story, and it is the same story throughout these ranks. Just listen.
He told Al Jazeera that the costs of living exceeded his monthly pension, so he had to return to the labor market to find work. Hao is currently working as an accountant for a store owner during the day and as a security guard for a hotel at night.
Can you imagine working in your 70s just so you can survive and your family can live a decent life? It's quite crazy to think of. What all this adds up to is a strain on China's elderly. Firstly, we have the physical and emotional strain that such responsibilities bring. Caring for young children can be physically demanding, especially for the elderly. The emotional burden of feeling responsible for the financial and physical well-being of multiple generations can also lead to stress and health issues. At a time when you're supposed to be taking it easy, you find yourself plagued with chronic illnesses and still shouldering the financial responsibilities of your children. That's intense. Secondly, it should go without saying that when you extended your working life beyond the limits just to assist and support your family, you're going to intensify any health problems you have, and this reduces your quality of life. Despite these woes, many people do not quite have a grasp on these problems of the elderly, and it is this frustration that has them protesting in the streets and seeking a better life, seeking justice. The question is the CCP listening? Judging from our earlier clips, no. Despite claiming to be a government for the people, the Chinese Communist Party needs to make aggressive policy changes and rectify this situation so it earns such claims. That is the obligation that a government has to its people. If things continue as they are, with protests and violence being inflicted all around, then the CCP puts itself in a compromising position where civil unrest will take root at massive scales. In any case, the elderly crisis weakens the CCP, so you would think that they would be scrambling to fix this to preserve their political power. Speaking of power and might, we also need to remember that the workforce is not the only sector that needs the young and fit to participate. China's military will undoubtedly suffer too at the hands of this aging crisis. An increasingly aging population will mean a reduced recruitment pool for military service. Do we even need to get into how this impacts the safety of China on the world stage? The tensions are running high on the global stage, meaning war can erupt at any minute, especially with the instigations and provocation that China likes to throw around. As we're seeing from the war in Ukraine, this is the wrong time for China to potentially have a shortage in its military force. If push comes to shove, China may have to make do with an aging military force, affecting its potential issues if war breaks out against it and its many enemies. Added to that is the issue of China's political position in the world. China's global influence is only as big as its economic strength in the global market. If its industries fall apart and its economy declines, what will China have to show for itself? China may fall back from leading the pack to playing catch-up from the outskirts. That is certainly an unwelcome outcome for the CCP, and if that were to happen, it would mark their unceremonious fall. So, there you have it, folks. China's elderly crisis is not a fairy tale or a problem for the next few generations. It's a problem that needs a swift response today, and solutions must be found now. As this aging problem worsens, China's political, social, and economic landscape is going to have to change very quickly if the nation wishes to survive. What's painfully clear is that the demographic gap will only get wider over time, and the measures China has tried to put into place so far are not doing anything to solve the problem. so they need something new on the table. One thing is for sure, the CCP will be looking at aggressive reformation soon, and we can only imagine what that will look like when it rears its head.
China's falling apart in the most bizarre way possible. Dead bodies are disappearing from graves, mortuaries, and medical institutions all over the country, causing a mass uproar. In a morbid and dark situation taken straight from a horror movie, Chinese citizens are missing and losing the bodies of their dead families. And this could all be part of a scheme that the CCP is now desperately trying to cover up.
A social media post shining a light on the business of turning human remains into profit in China. A Chinese lawyer posted an indictment on the country's largest social media platform last Thursday.
In northern China, prosecutors have uncovered a disturbing decade-long scheme involving the illegal sale of corpses meant for cremation.
It accused a Chinese company of illegally procuring thousands of bodies nationwide, then, quote, brutally dismembering them and culling flesh from bones.
With thousands of corpses missing and an elaborate multi-million-dollar theft scheme in place, the situation has developed into nothing less than a nationwide scandal. Today, we'll explore the origins and development of this terrible scandal. We'll also go over the impact it's had on Chinese society, and how the CCP's reign might come to an end because of it. As we dive into the underbelly of China's dark trafficking routes, we do so fully aware that any videos that talk about the CCP or Chinese failings tend to get swarmed with negative comments from bots as a CCP strategy to stop the spread of information that they might view as harmful to their image. That's why your likes are necessary, as they combat these bots and allow us to share these videos without fear or prejudice. So please drop a like. Okay, with that said, let's move on. Thousands of bodies have been illegally trafficked, dismembered, and sold to produce medical materials, and Chinese society is slowly learning about this. As we look into the modern implications of this scandal, it's first necessary that we take a step back into history. The origins of this issue of illegal human trade in China date back several decades, with various forms of trafficking taking place long before the modern era. Historically, China, like many other countries, has fought with a dark past filled with exploitation of vulnerable groups, including women, children, and ethnic minorities especially. We've made a video on this in the past, so feel free to browse the channel for it. In any case, this exploitation took the form of forced labor, sex trafficking, and, in more recent times, organ trafficking. In the late 20th century, as China began to open up its economy and modernize, the demand for human organs, particularly for transplants, began to rise sharply. This was due in part to advances in medical technology and a growing awareness of the benefits of organ transplants for treating various life-threatening conditions. When you factor in these things were happening in a country with a massive population that served as both the client and, for a lack of a better word, the material, it's easy to see why the illegal organ trafficking ring grew so quickly. That's why by the 1980s and 1990s, China had become a major player in the global organ trade. The country's rapid economic growth led to an increase in wealth and, consequently, a rise in demand for medical treatments that could extend life. However, China's cultural and religious beliefs about death, which often discouraged organ donation, meant that there was a significant shortage of legally donated organs. So, what can you imagine happens when we have massive demand and minimal legal supply? You probably guessed right. It resulted in the birth of the organ black market. During this period, there was a quick development of an illegal market where organs were sourced from less than ethical means. The most controversial and internationally condemned practice at the time was harvesting the organs from executed prisoners. For years, it was an open secret that China used the organs of prisoners who had been sentenced to death, often without their or their family's consent, to supply its booming transplant industry. As you can imagine, the CCP initially denied these allegations as best they could, but mounting evidence from human rights organizations, journalists, and former prisoners began to expose the extent of the practice. It was reported that prisoners were often executed in such a way that their organs could be harvested immediately, ensuring their viability for transplantation. Given the way the CCP operates, it's likely that many who were imprisoned were there simply because of political freedoms, ethnicity, or other irrelevant factors, and yet found themselves being the food source for a whole dark underground arena. In fact, the whole concept of imprisonment for certain groups of people might have existed just to cover up such deeds. Such unfortunate victim groups, including the Falun Gong spiritual movement and other religious and ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs and Tibetans, were being killed for their organs. It's so sick and infuriating. According to these reports, Falun Gong practitioners who've been persecuted by the Chinese government since 1999 are targeted because of their healthy lifestyles, making their organs particularly desirable. The condemnation of these deeds by the international community is why several countries banned organ tourism to China, where foreigners travel to receive transplants, often with little knowledge of the organ's origins. After facing mounting international pressure, China announced a series of reforms in the early 2010s aimed at curbing illegal organ trafficking. In 2015, the Chinese government claimed to have stopped using organs from executed prisoners, transitioning to a voluntary organ donation system. This would be great and welcome news, had it not been for the dead bodies disappearing scandal that's brought us here now. From where I'm sitting, it seems like all they did was change strategies, as I'll explain in a few minutes. Still, on that subject of trafficking, I think it's important to note that organ trafficking is just one facet of the broader human trafficking problem in China. Now, before we get into that, I quickly wanted to answer a question I recently got asked. A lot of you guys want to start a YouTube channel, but you're camera shy, or just not comfortable putting your face out there. In fact, I'm one of those people, and that's why this channel has no face on it. Luckily, you can still grow on YouTube even without showing your face or giving up your privacy. This channel's the living proof of that. In fact, here are just a few examples of channels that started in the last 12 months and grew an audience without showing their face. They've gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. We recently crossed 1 million subscribers, and along the way we've learned a few tips and tricks about YouTube that can be helpful to any of you who want to start your channel. We've included all of this in my completely free 7-day YouTube crash course bootcamp. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, this is the perfect starting point for you. What better way to convince you than to read a comment left by a previous student? This bootcamp's better than a paid course he took. So if you're interested in signing up, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. The country has long struggled with various forms of human exploitation, including forced labor, sex trafficking, and the abduction and sale of women and children. Rural poverty, gender imbalances due to the one-child policy, and lax law enforcement have all contributed to the prevalence of these practices. In rural areas, there have been numerous cases of women being kidnapped and sold as brides to men who, due to gender imbalance, are unable to find wives. Children, too, are often abducted and sold, either for adoption or for forced labor. The Chinese government has taken steps to combat human trafficking, but the scale of the problem and the involvement of organized crime make it a difficult issue to tackle effectively. Okay, with the history and background context out of the way, let's move on to the meat of how the dead body scandal has rocked China and the world this year. Everything began to unravel earlier this year when several reports and investigations exposed a network involved in the illegal trade of human remains. Several families in rural areas of China began to report that the bodies of their deceased relatives had mysteriously vanished from local funeral homes. These families, who naturally were expecting to carry out traditional burial ceremonies, were instead met with empty caskets and unconvincing explanations from funeral home staff. These families began to raise the alarm, seeking answers from local authorities. Unfortunately, the initial investigations by local police were slow and, in some cases, dismissive, with officials attributing the missing bodies to administrative errors or mishandling by funeral home staff. As this issue continued, mounting evidence of similar incidents in other regions started coming to light, forcing authorities to take the issue more seriously. With the matter now in the open, those with a knack for reporting took up arms and started diving into it. One key figure was Yi Shenghua, a lawyer who initially exposed the illegal activities on Weibo, China's social media platform. Despite efforts by the government to censor information and control the narrative, the story gained traction, leading to a broader investigation. As these investigative journalists and law enforcement dug deeper into the reports, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. This dark network, which stretched across several provinces, was primarily driven by the demand for bones and other body parts used in medical research, education, and the production of allogenic bone implants. The investigation revealed that some funeral homes, crematoriums, and even hospital morgues were complicit, and there were no administrative errors like previously reported, but a conscious awareness of what was happening. These institutions, often under financial pressure or influenced by corrupt officials, had been selling people's dead bodies to middlemen, who would then traffic the remains to buyers in the medical and pharmaceutical industries. The bodies were often dismembered, and the bones were processed into materials used in surgeries and other medical procedures. I don't know how you feel about this, but it's utterly despicable. One of the organizations behind this, Shanxi Aurori Biomaterials Company, is a major company in the medical materials industry in Taiyuan, the capital of Shanxi Province. After the bodies were cut up, they were sent for processing at this company. Over 4,000 corpses were traced to them, with estimates saying that Shanxi Aurori Biomaterials Company had pocketed around $53 million since 2015. During this investigation, the police seized more than 18 tons of human bone, raw materials, and semi-finished products, along with over 34,000 finished products from the involved companies. These are no small numbers. To acquire a large quantity of raw materials, Shanxi Aurori instructed employees to transport human bones from places like Guilin, Guangxi, and Chengdu, Sichuan. The bodies were selected and processed at Anatomy Teaching and Office Research in Guilin Medical University and Sichuan Hengpu Company before being transported back to the company for storage. To conceal their dealings, Shanxi Aurori forged documents, including voluntary body donation registration forms and inspection reports. Employees were also instructed to forge signatures on the donation forms, pretending to be family members. As more of the scheme came to light, the company's executives and several employees were arrested. The uncovering of this despicable scheme has placed the CCP under international scrutiny. To do some damage control, they dismissed several high-ranking officials in the regions where missing corpses had been reported, and also appointed a nationwide task to investigate the extent of the trade. The CCP has also tightened the regulations surrounding the handling of human remains and increased oversight of funeral homes and medical institutions. Even after all this damage control, public trust in the government and the medical industry has been severely shaken. Many people felt that the scandal was indicative of deeper systematic issues, including widespread corruption and a lack of transparency in how human remains are handled. Social media platforms like Weibo were flooded with posts expressing outrage and demanding justice for the families affected by the scandal. In response to the outcry, the CCP has been actively censoring such posts and trying to control the narrative. Again, your like on this video will help us out a lot. It makes you quite grateful for the modern age and the transfer of information. Such atrocities must be exposed without failure. On top of the local public outcry, there have been strong reactions from the international community as well. This scandal has further damaged China's reputation in the global medical industry, particularly in the area of organ and tissue transplants. Many of you are wondering what would fuel such wickedness, so I'll get into that now. Money is the root of all evil here because, as you probably guessed it, the primary driver is economic profit. The medical industry is highly lucrative, and the demand for human bones as raw materials is substantial. Companies like Shanxi Arui have made millions by selling these materials to hospitals and clinics, which then use them in various surgical procedures. Some people are willing to cross any line for money, and this proves that. Outside of the obvious money motivator, another reason is the massive gaps in regulation. Let me explain. You see, while China has laws governing the handling of human remains, enforcement is often weak and people take advantage of this. That's why this lack of transparency and oversight in the funeral and medical industries further worsens the problem, making it difficult to track the source of human remains and ensure that they're handled ethically. Coupled with this lack of oversight is the corruption and complicity within the system. The involvement of government officials and institutions suggests that there's a network of individuals who are either turning a blind eye to illegal activities or actively participating in them. There's simply no way companies like Shanxi Orui Biomaterials could run such a deep and nationwide program for close to 10 years without some red flags popping up. The fact that this has gone on for so long simply means that certain officials are complicit. Lastly, the scandal's happening due to cultural practices that exist within China. You see, in China, attitudes towards death and body donation are complicated and often influenced by traditional beliefs. Many people are reluctant to donate their bodies to science or for medical purposes, leading to a shortage of legally available bodies for research and medical use. They believe that doing such has spiritual repercussions, and so that shortage of organs has created an illegal market. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not victim blaming here. Not at all. I'm simply showing you how the imbalance of supply and demand has heightened the evils in Chinese society. Now, let's take a look at the possible implications that this scandal's created. After all, a scenario where people are profiting on the corpses of the dead is bound to have some dangers and implications, don't you think? Firstly, just looking at the ethical side of this illegal corpse trade, it doesn't take a judge to see that the desecration of human remains is a serious violation of human dignity. The idea that bodies, which should be treated with respect and care, are being dismembered and sold for profit is deeply troubling. This terrible act not only disrespects the deceased, but their families too. Also, from a health perspective, the use of illegally sourced human bones in medical procedures poses significant risks. There's no guarantee that these materials are safe or properly sanitized, increasing the likelihood of infections or complications during surgery. Considering that because there's no oversight over these bones and materials, there's no standard of health outside what the criminals themselves set. One of the biggest consequences, and the one we've documented clearly, is public outrage. The censorship by the CCP has only made things worse, and this scandal has completely eroded public trust. On the topic of loss of trust, this scandal's also removed the faith in China's medical industry. From here, if the public loses trust in the safety and integrity of medical products, it could lead to a decline in the use of certain treatments, potentially affecting the overall quality of healthcare. The international reputation of China's medical industry may also suffer more than it already has, particularly if other countries become wary of using Chinese-made medical products. As if all that's not enough, this scandal's also sparked a broader debate about the ethics of organ donation in China, with many calling for a complete overhaul of the system and stricter enforcement of the existing laws. I don't have all the answers, but let us throw in some suggestions for the CCP. First and foremost, enforcement of regulations needs to be strengthened. The government must close legal loopholes that allow companies to operate illegally and ensure that existing laws are rigorously enforced. This could include stricter licensing requirements for companies involved in the handling of human remains and more frequent inspections of funeral homes and medical institutions. In addition to this, public awareness and education are also necessary, if not crucial. Many people may not be aware of the risks associated with illegal body trade or the importance of ethical practices in the medical industry. A nationwide campaign to educate the public about these issues could help to reduce the demand for illegally sourced bodies and encourage more people to consider legal body donation. Once people understand the dangers of contamination and health on top of the legal punishment, many might not be in a hurry to go down that dark, scandalous path. Finally, there needs to be greater accountability and transparency within the CCP itself. Corruption and complicity in the illegal trade must be addressed, and those responsible should be held accountable with no exceptions. This may require an independent investigation into the scandal and the establishment of a watchdog agency to oversee the handling of human remains and prevent future abuses. So, where does this all leave us? Well, this scandal of missing corpses in China is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked corruption and the illegal trade in human remains. It's exposed significant flaws in the system and has led to a crisis of public trust that the CCP will need to address urgently. The ongoing investigations and the potential for further revelations mean that this story is far from over, and its impact will likely be felt for years to come. The Philippines has called out China. China's response is clearly not good. CCP has a nasty habit of stretching its borders and claiming territories that don't belong to it. Unfortunately, it's made a big mistake by choosing the Philippines as a victim this time around. In the past couple of weeks, tensions have been really high in the South China Sea, as Philippine and Chinese Coast Guard ships are reporting multiple collisions in the region.
As a Chinese Coast Guard ship collides with a 97-meter Philippines vessel. The Philippines Coast Guard says one of its largest vessels sustained widespread damage.
Both sides are blaming each other for the collision. According to the Philippine government, the Chinese Coast Guard vessel hit a Philippine Coast Guard vessel 3 times.
First, real quick, we need your help. CCP bots are fighting hard against this type of content, and we need your help to fight them off. Please leave a quick like on this video to help us push against the YouTube algorithm so we can continue to bring you informative content. On the 19th of August, several Chinese and Philippine vessels collided near the Sabina Shoal, with the Chinese Coast Guard claiming that the Philippine vessel deliberately collided with them. The shoal, which has been claimed by China as Jianbinjiao and as Escota Shoal by the Philippines, is located some 75 miles from the Philippines' west coast and 360 miles from China. This incident was followed by a second round of collisions with both sides once again blaming each other. The Philippines claimed that the Chinese Coast Guard vessel 5205 intentionally rammed into the Philippines vessel. On the other hand, the Chinese claimed that the Philippine ship was illegally stranded at the shoal and deliberately rammed into them. Another incident also occurred on the 26th of August, where the Philippines claimed that 40 Chinese ships prevented 2 of their boats from conducting a humanitarian mission to restock the Teresa Magbuana, a Philippine Coast Guard ship deployed months earlier to the shoal. Again, China continued with its rehearsed defense that its actions on the sea have been professional and appropriate. The running theory by the Philippines is that China is attempting to reclaim land at Sabina Shoal, with reports that Beijing is using that raw material to expand the shoal. Of course, China's denied this, stating that the claims are groundless and unscientific. Although these are the most recent incidents, China and the Philippines have been at it since the beginning of the year. We'll start with a small incident in January, where a Filipino fishing boat captain claimed the Chinese Coast Guard drove him away from Scarborough Shoal and forced him to dump his catch into the sea. The Scarborough Shoal is a triangular reef formation that is a source of contention because of its rich waters and marine resources. It's been the site of a lot of Manila-Beijing disputes in the past couple of months, and in May, 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen broke through the blockade of Chinese vessels and reached the shoal. Back at the Second Thomas Shoal in March, Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard vessels collided, injuring 4 Filipino crew members. Things got more dangerous in April this year when a Chinese Coast Guard ship fired water cannons at 2 Philippine patrol vessels near the Scarborough Shoal, which could soon overtake the Second Thomas Shoal as the 2 nations' biggest shoal fight. Again, in June this year, a Chinese Coast Guard rammed a Filipino resupply boat. The Chinese sailors were brandishing makeshift spears, which cost a Filipino soldier one of his fingers. The Philippine military chief, General Romero Bronner, stated that they were outnumbered and the Filipino crew had been unarmed and had fought with their bare hands. In response to these allegations, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian said that Manila's comments on the clash were bogus and that the Philippines was to blame. According to them, Filipino boats have been ramming into Chinese vessels. Beijing wants us to believe that their Coast Guard has been professional and restrained during the confrontation, and that no direct measures were taken against Filipino personnel. As we can see throughout this year, the interactions have moved from microaggressions to full-on fights. With fights persisting from the Scarborough Shoal, the Second Thomas Shoal, and the Sabina Shoal, it's clear that the Philippines and China are not seeing eye to eye in the South China Sea. There's always been tension between the two nations, but the fight for the shoals intensified in June last year, when Chinese soldiers attacked Filipino sailors with machetes and hammers while they were on their way to resupply their soldiers stationed on a warship. Footage has been released by the Filipino military showing Chinese Coast Guard officers brandishing an axe and other bladed or pointed tools at the Filipino soldiers and slashing their rubber boats. China and the Philippines have been fighting a lot in the South China Sea, 9 times in just August alone. But you might not have seen that news, because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitics news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up now by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. Both sides blamed each other for the confrontation, but knowing China, this was definitely one of their acts of aggression. We would think that by now China would have managed to win this border dispute. China's been known to bully smaller nations into a corner, but surprisingly, the Philippines has been giving it a run for its money. After the incident in June this year, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. stated, "We will never be intimidated or oppressed by anyone." He's pledged to continue to exercise our freedoms and rights in support of our national interests in accordance with international law. This lets us know that these disputes are probably going to be going on for a very long time. Now, if you've been a loyal subscriber for a while, you'll know that this is not the first time that China's come head-to-head with the Philippines in this area. We've discussed the most recent aggressions, but now I want to explain why the South China Sea is such a hot zone for disputes. Later on, we'll also shed a light on how the USA is tangled up in all of this. The South China Sea is a sea in the western Pacific Ocean that is about 3.5 million square kilometers. Its positioning is the source of contention as it's right in the middle of these 6 nations. The sea is south of China and Taiwan, between Vietnam and the Philippines, and north of Brunei and Malaysia. It holds 2 groups of islands, the Spratly Islands in the south and the Paracel Islands in the north. As you can expect, the dispute is territorial, as all 6 countries claim a part of the sea and the islands within it. China's claim of the islands is the largest, demarcating it by the so-called 9-dash line. These lines are based on a 1936 map by Chinese cartographer Bai Meichu. The line comprises 9 dashes that extend hundreds of miles south and east from its most southerly province of Hainan. China also claims that the territory has been part of it for centuries, including the Paracel and Spratly Island chains. Outside of the territorial issues with the island, there are other things that have made the South China Sea worth the fight. The South China Sea is one of the busiest waterways for global trade, with ships carrying an estimated 30% of global crude oil through it. What's even more interesting is that its seabed is believed to hold huge oil and gas reserves. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the sea is estimated to have 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. It's also home to rich fishing grounds, and more than half of the world's fishing vessels operate in this area. The Paracels and the Spratlys have been rumored to have reserves of natural resources around them. Specifically for China, the South China Sea is its second most used sea lane in the world after the Dover Strait, and 60% of its total trade and 80% of its oil imports transit through the region. To add to its appeal on the tourism front, the islands of the South China Sea have a lot to offer. Beach resorts like the Philippines' Boracay have some stunning beaches and beautiful sunsets. The cruise tourism market is also booming, with ships operating from China, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines going into the sea. Having control over more islands in the region means being able to take a slice out of the tourism pie. Now, while all these things make the South China Sea a worthy territory, what's probably fueling the fire is the fact that the sea is such a strategic military location. Because the sea is so close to so many countries, many of them are looking to drop military bases and installations around islands and shoals. China's been camouflaging military ships on the sea, claiming that they're just fishing boats. Beijing's aim is for the ships to provide backup to the China Coast Guard and maintain a constant presence in remote waters. In addition to its military buildup, China has already built sea military bases on the Spratly Reefs while also flying its fighter jets above the sea. Now that we've looked at the reason for the numerous fights, let's trace out some of the earlier contentions for the South China Sea. China's aggression in the region and its claims have been a problem, as each of the 6 countries occupies at least one of the islands. As the CCP has become more militarized in its activities in the sea, Vietnam and the Philippines have been the 2 nations that have given China the most grief about its claims. In the 1900s, China and Vietnam fought for the region, with the 2 fighting for the Spratly and Paracel Islands. In 1974, China seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam, killing more than 75 Vietnamese soldiers in the process. In 2014, China moved an oil rig into Vietnamese waters, which sparked massive protests in Vietnam. What's worse is China's been known to arrest foreign fishermen and sailors in waters they consider to be their own. China's fights with Vietnam are few and spread out, but Manila and Beijing have been at each other's throats consistently throughout the years. In the early 2000s, the Philippines and China were at it, with things intensifying in 2013. Things got so bad that the Philippines filed a case against China at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. After a long back and forth, the Philippines Foreign Minister Albert Del Rosario stated that the Philippines has exhausted almost all political and diplomatic avenues for a peaceful negotiated settlement of its maritime dispute with China. The Philippines wanted the court to rule on what territorial claims it was owed in the South China Sea, and to determine if China had infringed on its territorial rights through China's construction and fishing activities. Since China's a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Philippines hoped that they could be held accountable. China refused to take part in the case, claiming that UNCLOS was beyond its jurisdiction. On July 12, 2016, the arbitral tribunal adjudicating the case ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines, determining that major elements of China's claim, including its 9-dash line, recent land reclamation activities, and other activities in Philippine waters, were unlawful. As you saw earlier in our discussion, the Second Thomas Shoal has been the main center of the dispute between China and the Philippines. The shoal is a reef that is about 124 miles from Palawan, Philippines, but more than 621 miles from China. It's been widely considered to belong to the Philippines because of how close it is to it. Unfortunately, China does not agree with this, despite the ruling by the International Tribunal that China had no legal rights to the shoal, which is in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Philippines have had a military presence on the shoal since 1999, and they have no plans on moving anytime soon. The BRP Sierra Madre has been docked on it and has served as a base for some of its troops for many years. Despite this, China's been fighting for the tiny shoal, and many believe it's because its strategic location would be perfect for a naval base. Some even say that it could also be because the area has rich oil and gas reserves, but that is yet to be proved. This is all so messy, but now we're gonna take a detour to discuss US involvement in the matter. Although the US has no territorial claim in the South China Sea, they have been performing freedom of navigation exercises around the area. These are basically naval operations conducted by countries to demonstrate their rights to navigate through international waters. This is an international law right that's stated in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. One of the reasons behind this right is to challenge excessive maritime claims by asserting military presence and capabilities. The US has been carrying out these exercises in the South China Sea as a way of telling China to pipe down and show its influence. The US amped up its exercises under the Trump administration, and they've been sailing their vessels near or around features claimed by China. Washington's actions have been frustrating to Beijing, and in 2021, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson said, It is the United States which has actually militarized the area and threatened freedom of navigation. The country, over 8,300 miles from the South China Sea, has built several military bases with offensive weapons around the area, and frequently sent aircraft carriers and strategic bombers throughout the year. One of the major reasons that the US has gotten involved in this maritime dispute is that it has a stake in the sea remaining open. With the freedom of the seas principle under maritime law, the US can enjoy movement in trade and for its military pursuits. If China gets to claim the South China Sea as its territory, the US and many other nations will not be able to use the waterway freely. The Philippines is also an ally of the US, so their involvement in the area is also to maintain stability. They have a mutual defense treaty with the US, which means that if the contention of the South China Sea turns to war, the US would be obligated to step in. We also need to look at the fact that despite China's feelings that the US is overly involved, the US has really been trying to stay neutral. Beryl Nowens, an executive director for Asia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, states that responding to coercive actions in the gray zone is difficult precisely because the lines between peace and conflict are blurred. What's ensured that the US has kept its antics to a minimum is the fact that it also has been trying to reduce its tension with China. President Biden has made it clear that he seeks only to have friendly competition with China, and that America is looking to consolidate a friendship with China. This means that the US is towing a delicate line, and the Philippines will probably have to keep fighting its own battles in the region. As the fights between the two nations escalate at an alarming rate, we need to start talking about what could happen next. Things could escalate further, as there are reports that Beijing wants to implement a new policy that would authorize the Chinese Coast Guard to detain foreigners crossing into waters claimed by China. This is a direct violation of international law, and it could see more than just the Philippines going head-to-head with China. In the meantime, the Philippines is not lying idle. Manila is working on deepening its alliance with Washington, and the two countries have carried out military drills together. This also took place on an island chain in the northern Philippines with the practice launch of an anti-cruise missile that sunk a decommissioned ship. While the US has been neutral till this point, a strengthening of the alliance could be a sign that it may be willing to act with the Philippines in the near future. The Philippines has been carrying out a number of security drills and signing agreements with other countries like Australia and Japan. Currently, Japan and the Philippines are discussing a reciprocal troop access agreement, and the Philippines and Australia have upgraded their cooperation in maritime security. The Philippines is doing a lot of leveling up on the military front, giving China a reason to be afraid. Currently, it's a waiting game, and the next act of aggression will show us the intentions of the two nations. At present, Manila continues to record each incident and publicize it for the world to see. By showing us who China really is, the Philippines is preparing for the time that it does actually hit back. When it finally pushes China out with military force, the international community will be able to understand what led to that point.